For 30 years, scientists have known with absolute certainty where the human species began. The genetic evidence is not debated. The fossil record is not contested. The molecular biology is settled in a way that almost nothing in science ever gets fully settled. Every human being alive on Earth today traces their ancestry back to one continent, one population, one origin point proven beyond any reasonable scientific argument by the early 1990s. And yet right now, today, in classrooms across the developed world, millions of students are either not being taught this fact at all, or being taught it so briefly and so incompletely that they leave school without understanding what it actually means. When an AI was asked to trace exactly why that gap exists, its answer was not what anyone expected, because it did not stop at the science. It traced the pattern all the way back to 1924. And what it found, sitting at the beginning of that pattern, was not a scientific disagreement. It was a fabricated skull that an entire generation of experts chose to believe over a genuine fossil, because the genuine fossil pointed to the wrong continent. Stay with me for this entire video, because what I am going to walk you through is not just the story of where humanity began, as remarkable as that story is on its own. This is the story of how a comfortable lie stayed in scientific textbooks for nearly 30 years, while the truth sat dismissed in a drawer in South Africa. It is the story of how the machinery that turns scientific discovery into classroom education moves so slowly that settled facts can take a full generation to reach the students who most need to hear them. And it is the story of what it actually means when science finally gets something right. But the institutions responsible for teaching that science decide, consciously or not, that they are not quite ready to say so clearly. Let us start with the science itself, because you cannot understand the resistance without first understanding what was being resisted. The question of where modern humans originated sounds like it should have a simple answer. We have been digging up fossils for over a century. We have geological dating tools that can put precise ages on ancient bones. We have comparative anatomy that can trace physical similarities between species across millions of years of evolutionary time. Given all of that, the question of where Homo sapiens first emerged as a distinct species should have been answerable well before the 20th century ended. It was not. Not because the evidence was unclear, because the evidence pointed somewhere that significant portions of the scientific establishment did not want to look. By the middle of the 20th century, two competing answers to the human origins question had emerged and hardened into opposing camps. The first was called the multi-regional hypothesis. It proposed that early human ancestors left Africa roughly 2 million years ago as Homo erectus, a species that predates modern humans, and from there evolved separately but in parallel into modern Homo sapiens across Asia, Europe, and Africa simultaneously. Under this model, every major geographic region of the world contributed its own evolutionary thread to the human species we are today. Europeans evolved from European ancestors. Asians evolved from Asian ancestors. Each regional population had its own deep independent lineage, stretching back millions of years. The second answer was called the recent African origin model, and it proposed something far simpler, far more direct, and to many scientists at the time, far less comfortable. Modern humans, Homo sapiens as a fully formed distinct species, evolved in Africa within the last 200,000 years. A relatively small founding population then migrated outward, beginning somewhere between 60,000 and 120,000 years ago, spreading across Asia, Europe, Australia, and eventually the Americas, replacing every other human population they encountered. Under this model, every single non-African person alive today is descended from that relatively recent migration out of one continent. There is no independent European lineage. There is no independent Asian lineage. There is one origin, one starting point, one continent. For decades, this was not a settled question. It was an active, genuinely contested scientific debate. And the weight of institutional preference, the direction that funding flowed, the theories that got the prominent journal placements, the fossils that received the most serious consideration, did not sit evenly on both sides. To understand why, you have to understand what happened in 1924. In that year, a young anatomy student brought a box of fossilized bones to Raymond Dart, an anatomist working at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. The fossils had come from a limestone quarry near a small town called Tongue. Dart spent weeks carefully extracting a small skull from the surrounding rock matrix, working with whatever tools he had available because proper paleontological equipment was not accessible to him. What emerged from that rock was the skull and a natural brain cast of a child, approximately 3 to 4 years old at the time of death. The skull had an ape-sized brain, that much aligned with what scientists expected from ancient pre-human remains, but the rest of it did not fit what European science had been telling itself about human evolution. The teeth and jaw structure showed distinctly human-like characteristics, and most significantly, the foramen magnum, The opening at the base of the skull, where the spinal column connects to the brain, was positioned in a way that indicated upright walking. In a knuckle-walking ape, that opening angles backward. In a creature that walks upright on two legs, it sits underneath the skull, oriented downward. The Tong child's foramen magnum sat exactly like that of a biped. This fossil was not an ape. It was something in between. And it had been walking upright in Africa millions of years before any human ancestor appeared anywhere else on Earth. Dart named it Australopithecus africanus, southern ape from Africa, and published his findings in the scientific journal Nature in February of 1925. He argued clearly and with full anatomical documentation that this fossil was direct evidence of human ancestors first evolving on the African continent. The leading anthropologists of the era rejected him almost immediately. And here is where the story stops being simply about scientific caution and starts being about something else entirely. At the exact moment Dart published his African evidence, the dominant fossil in British and European anthropology was something called Piltdown Man. Found in a gravel pit in Sussex, England in 1912, Piltdown Man appeared to show a remarkably large, human-like brain case paired with an ape-like jaw. It fit perfectly into the assumption that many European scientists already held about human evolution, that the defining step toward humanity was the development of a large brain, and that this crucial development had happened in Europe. Piltdown Man was exactly what European science wanted the missing link to look like. It was celebrated, exhibited, and taught in universities as genuine evidence. Dart's African skull showed the precise opposite. A small ape-sized brain paired with human-like locomotion. It suggested that walking upright came before the brain enlarged, and it placed that crucial development firmly in Africa, on a continent that European science had already decided was peripheral to the story of human progress. Sir Arthur Keith, one of the most respected and widely cited anatomists in Britain, publicly dismissed the Tong child as nothing more than a juvenile ape. His opinion carried enough institutional weight that very few of his peers felt the need to examine the evidence more carefully. Dart traveled to London in 1930, carrying his fossil, hoping to defend his findings to the scientific establishment that had dismissed them. He found almost no support. He returned to South Africa and continued his research largely alone for years. Here is what makes this story far more than a simple case of scientific debate. In 1953, Piltdown Man was finally subjected to rigorous chemical dating analysis. The results were unambiguous and devastating. The Piltdown fossil was a deliberate forgery. A modern human skull had been artificially paired with the filed-down jaw of an orangutan. Both pieces had been chemically stained to simulate age. Whoever constructed it had taken considerable care to make sure it matched exactly what British science already expected to find. The forgery was sophisticated enough that it fooled leading experts for 41 years. For 41 years, a fabricated piece of evidence that pointed to Europe sat at the center of mainstream human origin science, while a genuine fossil that pointed to Africa sat dismissed, its discoverers professionally marginalized, his evidence treated as the work of an over-enthusiastic regional researcher who had misidentified what he found. Let that sit for a moment. 41 years. The entirety of two entire scientific generations formed their understanding of human origins around a skull that someone had constructed in a workshop. And during those same 41 years, the real evidence was in South Africa, documented, published, anatomically sound, pointing directly to the truth that genetics would later confirm beyond any remaining argument. Even after Piltdown Man collapsed in 1953, acceptance of African origins came slowly. Lewis and Mary Leakey spent decades at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, working in brutal conditions on funding that frequently ran out, building a fossil record of some of the oldest tool-making hominid remains found anywhere on Earth. Their work through the 1950s and 1960s steadily strengthened the African case, discovery by difficult discovery. Then, in 1974, American anthropologist Donald Johanson, working in Ethiopia, uncovered nearly 40% of a single ancient skeleton, remarkable completeness for a specimen of its age. His team named her Lucy, after a song playing at their camp the night of the discovery. Her remains dated to approximately 3.2 million years ago, making her at the time the oldest and most complete early human ancestor ever found anywhere. She was unmistakably African. Even with Lucy's skeleton available, a physical, datable, undeniable African ancestor at 3.2 million years old, the multi-regional hypothesis maintained serious institutional support well into the 1980s. It continued to be taught in universities as a legitimate live alternative rather than a retreating minority view. The question of why it held on so long against mounting African fossil evidence is exactly where the AI analysis produced its most significant and most uncomfortable answer. Because the answer was not primarily about the fossils. In the 1980s, geneticists developed the tools to extract and analyze mitochondrial DNA, a form of genetic material that passes almost exclusively through the maternal line, from mother to child, generation after generation, largely untouched by the genetic recombination that reshuffles ordinary chromosomal DNA with every new generation. That stability made it extraordinarily useful for tracing deep ancestry. Mitochondrial DNA mutates at a roughly predictable rate over time. By comparing mitochondrial DNA samples from modern human populations distributed across the entire globe, counting the small accumulated differences between them, researchers could calculate with real statistical confidence how long ago any two populations last shared a common ancestor. The results, published in the late 1980s and refined throughout the early 1990s, were not ambiguous. They were not subject to the interpretive uncertainty that fragmentary fossil evidence always carries. They were clear in a way that settled the question permanently. Populations outside Africa showed dramatically less genetic diversity than populations within Africa. The difference was not subtle. African populations carried far deeper, far more varied genetic lineages than any population anywhere else on Earth. This is precisely the pattern you would expect if a relatively small group had left the continent recently, in evolutionary terms, and spread outward carrying only a fraction of Africa's accumulated genetic variation with them. If the multi-regional hypothesis were correct, if humans had been evolving independently across multiple continents for roughly 2 million years, the genetic diversity should have been roughly comparable everywhere. Each region would have had similar depths of genetic history. That is not what the data showed. Every single human population on Earth traced its mitochondrial lineage back to Africa, to a shared common ancestor living on that continent within the last 200,000 years. The scientific community called her Mitochondrial Eve. She was African. When the AI was asked to trace exactly why the multi-regional hypothesis had persisted with serious institutional support for as long as it had, given the fossil evidence accumulating against it, the answer it produced was precise in a way that pure historical summary rarely manages to be. The multi-regional hypothesis offered something the African origin model did not offer. It offered every major population on Earth its own independent evolutionary story. It allowed European populations to claim deep European lineage. It allowed Asian populations to claim deep Asian lineage. Each region could look at itself and see not a recent arrival descended from African migrants, but an ancient indigenous presence with roots stretching back millions of years into its own soil. The African origin model offered none of that. It said everyone came from one place, one continent, one founding population that was unambiguously African, and then spread outward. The AI was direct about the limits of that observation. It cannot read the private motivations of individual researchers. Many scientists who supported the multi-regional view were rigorous, good-faith researchers, working carefully with genuinely fragmentary evidence and reaching honest conclusions that the available data at the time could support. The observation is not about individual intent. It is about which conclusions faced institutional headwinds and which did not. The African origin model, with its stronger fossil support, still had to fight for decades against a competing hypothesis that aligned more comfortably with existing assumptions about where human significance belonged on the map. That is the same dynamic that made a fabricated European skull more credible to a generation of experts than a genuine African fossil. Piltdown Man was believed partly because it confirmed what was already assumed. The Tongue Child was dismissed partly because it contradicted those same assumptions. The mechanism that produced both outcomes is the same mechanism. It just operated in a university lecture hall in one case and in a quarry in Sussex in the other. By the 1990s, the combination of three independent lines of evidence, the fossil record, the genetic data, and molecular biology, had made the recent African origin model the settled consensus it remains today. The question was closed. Modern humans evolved in Africa. They began migrating outward approximately 60,000 to 120,000 years ago. Every non-African population on Earth is descended from that migration. This is not a theory under active debate. It is confirmed science. Which brings us to the part of the AI's analysis that moved the conversation entirely out of the laboratory and into a question that affects every person watching this video. If the science has been settled for over 30 years, why does public understanding still lag so dramatically behind it? The AI traced this to the mechanics of how scientific consensus actually travels from the research community to the classroom, a process that moves at a genuinely different pace than the science itself. Textbook revision cycles in many school districts run on schedules measured in years, sometimes stretching to a decade or more between major content updates. Museum exhibits, once designed and installed, can remain largely unchanged for an entire generation. Documentary films produced in the 1970s and 1980s, when the multi-regional hypothesis still held real institutional credibility, continue to circulate in classrooms and on streaming platforms today, presenting what was then a live debate as though that debate never reached a conclusion. The numbers that back this up are not speculative. A study published in 2008 by researchers Michael Berkman and Eric Plutzer surveyed American high school biology teachers and found that 17% skip human evolution entirely. A further 60% spend fewer than 5 total hours on the subject across an entire school year. 5 hours on the question of where the human species came from. The Next Generation Science Standards, finalized in 2013 and adopted by most states, still do not explicitly require that human evolution be taught as a core curriculum element. The National Center for Science Education, which tracks these gaps systematically, has identified the omission as one of the most consistent examples of thoroughly settled science failing to reach students. The result is a lag effect entirely separate from the original institutional resistance of the 1920s, one where public understanding trails the actual research not by a few years, but sometimes by a full generation. Students are graduating from high school in the 2020s without a clear understanding of something science confirmed in the early 1990s. And for specific groups of students, that gap carries weight that goes beyond simple educational incompleteness. For Black students in particular, for students of African descent in countries whose educational systems were built on histories that rarely centered African achievement or African significance, the gap between what science knows and what classrooms teach carries a specific kind of weight. The settled science says the entire human species, every person alive on every continent, traces their origin to Africa. That fact, taught fully and clearly, says something profound about the relationship between Africa and every other human population on Earth. It says the human story began there, that every civilization, every scientific achievement, every piece of music, mathematics, philosophy, and literature produced by human beings anywhere in the world was produced by descendants of African ancestors. That is what the settled science says. And yet a student can sit through 12 years of formal education in the United States today and never have that fact stated clearly, directly, and with the full confidence the evidence demands. The AI drew a direct line between the two eras. The same institutional pattern that made a fabricated European skull more believable than a genuine African fossil in 1925 did not disappear when Piltdown Man was exposed as a forgery in 1953. It moved. It relocated from the laboratory, where genetic evidence eventually made it impossible to sustain, into the slower and less visible machinery of textbook committees, curriculum boards, publishing decisions, and funding priorities, where comfortable assumptions can persist quietly for decades without ever being formally challenged or even consciously acknowledged. The AI was honest about what it cannot claim. It cannot prove that any individual sitting on any curriculum board made a deliberate choice to minimize African origins in what their district teaches. It cannot access private motivations or internal conversations. What it can do, and what it did, is trace a documented, verifiable, historically consistent pattern. A real fossil rejected in 1924. A real forgery believed for 41 years. Real genetic confirmation achieved in the early 1990s. A real, measurable, statistically documented gap in how consistently that confirmation reaches students today. That pattern does not require speculation about anyone's intentions. It only requires looking honestly at outcomes. And the outcome is that a scientific fact confirmed decades ago is still not being taught with the confidence and clarity the evidence has demanded since before most people currently alive were born. Think about the full shape of what this means once you put it all together in sequence. Raymond Dart pulled a fossil from a box in 1924 and held in his hands the evidence that would eventually be confirmed as part of the deepest truth about where every human being on Earth came from. The scientific establishment of his era, shaped by assumptions about where human significance belonged on a map, dismissed that evidence and placed their credibility behind a skull that someone had assembled from mismatched pieces in order to say what science already wanted to hear. The forgery held for 41 years. The genuine evidence spent decades being treated as the less serious claim. When genetics made the African origin conclusion impossible to avoid, the consensus shifted. But the shift in what students are actually taught has never fully caught up with the shift in what scientists actually know. The Tong child told the truth from the moment Dart freed it from the rock. The truth was not welcomed. It was not comfortable. It did not fit the assumptions of the people with the most institutional power to decide what counted as credible evidence. And so it waited. While a fake skull sat in a place of honor in British museums and British lecture halls, the real evidence waited in South Africa for the world to be ready to take it seriously. The world eventually got there. Science eventually got there. The question now, the question the AI's analysis puts directly on the table, is whether the institutions responsible for teaching science to the next generation are ready to get there too, ready to teach settled facts with the confidence those facts earned 3 decades ago, ready to say clearly and without qualification that the human species has one origin, one starting point, one continent from which every person alive today ultimately descends. The bones told the truth from 1924. The genes confirmed it by 1990. The question sitting in front of every school board, every curriculum committee, every textbook publisher, and every teacher making decisions about what to cover and what to leave out is simple. How much longer does the classroom need?